So tomorrow, of course, is Indigenous Peoples Day. And as you've already heard, there is a community celebration tomorrow at 5 p.m. in Friendship Square. I'm going to be on an airplane, so I can't be there this year, but I went last year, and it was wonderful. So I highly recommend, if you have time in your day to go be there, that you do so. Here at church, we've lifted up Indigenous Peoples Day in worship every year, at least since I arrived in 2012. I think maybe longer. We take advantage of this annual opportunity to take a more honest look at the history of this continent, to acknowledge that Europeans invaded rather than discovered, to grieve the high cost that the more than 400 discrete nations of Indigenous peoples in North and South America paid in the wake of that invasion. We've participated in a powerful ritual that reenacted and helped us embody this painful history. We've reflected on our denomination-wide repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. We've reached out to the tribes who originally inhabited this place to offer our help and support in whatever ways they are needed. And we've heard from powerful Indigenous speakers and scholars, including Gary Dorr, Mary Jane Oatman, and Jan Johnson. Last year, our own Rodney Frey shared his wisdom and experiences as a professor of ethnology and a member of the Crow, an adopted member of the Crow tribe with us. It was beautiful and quite a gift. Thank you. A recurring theme that runs through everything we've learned is that the difference between the European mindset that sees the land as a thing and the plants and animals on the land primarily as sources of income, and the Indigenous mindset which sees the land as sacred and the plants and animals as holy beings. I've heard Rodney say that the Indigenous culture and stories are shaped by the landscapes and give it shape in return. He also informed me just this morning that the words that we say in our welcome, the names of the tribes, are the people of this place. The people of this place where the rock is in the river in terms of the Palouse. Just the people of this place for the Chichumsh or the Coeur d'Alene. This is the connection to place is deep and intrinsic in these cultures. Indigenous wisdom holds that it's not just possible and desirable, but absolutely necessary to cultivate an intimate relationship with the natural world. So today we'll spend some time entering into that relationship, reflecting on that relationship. We'll think about this beautiful place we live in. We'll touch on its geologic history, its biology and ecology, and we'll imagine what it might be like to embrace a sense of rootedness, a sense of place. How might we be healed if we are able to do this? How might we be transformed? One of the things that Gary Dorr said when he came a few years ago is that water's the first medicine, and he invited all of us into the practice of beginning our day with a glass of water and a gesture of gratitude to the earth and to the medicine that is water. And I've actually done it. Every morning I have a glass of water before I have my coffee, and I look out into the backyard, and I drink my water, and I look at the light on the trees. It's a lovely practice. I recommend it highly. Speaking of water. Our first reading today comes from a book written by one of my colleagues. It's called Making the Good Life Last: 4 Keys to Sustainable Living. It's by the Reverend Michael Schuler. And his 4 key practices for sustainable living, we hear a lot about recycling or using LED lights or whatever. His 4 practices are: pay attention, stay put, exercise patience, and practice prudence. Shall I say those again? Pay attention, stay put, exercise patience, practice prudence. It's a great book. I recommend it. And it's in his chapter on staying put that I found these two paragraphs. So he writes, naturalist Gary Ferguson tells the story of a group of Eastern scholars who went on an anthropological expedition in the 1920s to meet with Northern California's Pitt River, Achumawi Indian tribe. During an exchange with a member of that band, one of the researchers asked, what was that word in the Achumawi language for a recent arrival such as himself? Reluctant to answer, the man to whom the question was put looked toward his elders for guidance. After the researcher repeated his question, an older Indian responded. The word is in Aladui, he said softly. It means tramp. The label was applied because the native people couldn't understand why whites traveled through a place without ever binding the land to their hearts. We think a part of you may be dead inside, the old man said sympathetically. Our second reading is a poem called Earth Homework by Sam McGill. Look, underneath our hurriedness, the earth moves. Time is eons. Rock bends, folds back upon itself, washes clean in long, flowing water. She was made before you, lies deep beneath the forest floor, bears all of us with sweet support. Linger here a very long time. See? She moves, grain by grain. Washed away, set down again. Mountain becomes plain. Plain is cut to gorge. Seafloor rolls, folds, pushes, births, mountains. Tired of your hurriedness? Go home. Stay put. Earth will be there still flowing like solid rock. If only we stayed still long enough to be so carved, settled down grain by unique small grain, and hardened by pressure long endured, yet soft enough to be formed by sacred water, and wind exposing our essence, then washed away in utter silence. We just sang Spirit of Life, and in the middle of the song, you'll have noticed are the words, roots hold me close. Roots hold me close. When we sing them, what do we mean? What if these words refer to a way of being rooted here in the place where we live? What if the roots that hold us close are sunk into the soil below our feet? What are the ways in which our interior landscape changes and shifts when we pay attention to the place where we are rooted? If we embrace the truth that we exist as a part of this particular bioregion, not apart from it. Now, I am, of course, a relative newcomer to the Palouse. I arrived just over 7 years ago. I spent the first 16 years of my life in the granite hills of New Hampshire. For years after I left, even as I moved all over the place, 10 moves in 13 years, including a stint in the other Moscow, Russia, still it was the White Mountains and the deciduous forest there that felt like home. Driving up Interstate 93, once I would pass the hooks at toll booth, I'd start to get that feeling in my blood and in my bones. This is where I belong. In the reading, the Native American elder speaks of the land that is bound to the heart, and New Hampshire for me was that for a very long time. But then in 2004, I was transplanted to the Pacific Northwest. We lived for 8 years on the Kitsap Peninsula west of Seattle. And I remember the first time I got that same feeling, that feeling of coming home to my place, the place that was bound to my heart. And I got it here in the Northwest, and I got it as I was flying into SeaTac and caught sight of Mount Rainier through the plane window. And it was shocking to feel it here. This wasn't home. And then it was. It was. And it triggered in me a desire to learn more about the geologic history. And so I did that on that side of the mountains. And this kind of sermon gives me a great excuse to go a little bit deeper. I think science is one of the ways we listen. Science is one of the ways we listen, and listen carefully to the world, to nature, and to the animals and plants that live there. So, and it's interesting, once I started having that "this is my place" feeling, this is the land that's bound to my heart here in the Northwest, when I go back to New England, I don't have it anymore. So there's a sense of loss, actually. What I feel like when I go back to New England, which I am doing tomorrow, I fly out to go back to New England to meet my twin niece and nephew and to go to a week-long board meeting. So much for staying put. But I don't feel that, it doesn't feel like home anymore. It feels like a place I used to know, a place I used to be. Now, the move to the Palouse from the Kitsap Peninsula wasn't as dramatic a change for me as that cross-country transition. We just sort of got in the car and drove over. But I remember on my very first visit, when I was interviewing with the search committee way back in February of 2012, I remember standing in the hotel parking lot and looking west over the hills to the horizon. And I remember even then thinking, this place feels like it could be home. And now it is home. It's definitely home. Coming from the west, I get that feeling of belonging when I pass the pig statue made out of old oil drums. You know what I'm talking about? Coming from the south, if I'm coming north, I get that feeling when I hit the Lewiston grade. Like going up the Lewiston grade, I'm like, okay, I get to the top, I'm home. Coming from the north, it's when I pass Phillips Farm Park. It's like, okay, now I'm not traveling, now I'm home. And of course, those are my boundaries. The actual boundaries of the Palouse are a little bit disputed, but as I understand it, our home, our land, our place, consists of about 2 million acres, north of the Snake and the Clearwater, south of Lake Coeur d'Alene. The western edge is at that place on Route 6 where you start seeing basalt at the side of the road and irrigation rigs in the field. And to the east, the Palouse is bounded by the St. Joe Forest. Now, as I understand it, what makes the Palouse are those rolling hills, which are essentially sand dunes, not normal hills formed by volcanic action or folds in the earth. The soil that makes up the hills holds water well enough that dry land farming of wheat, farming without irrigation, is possible here on the Palouse. That's why the irrigation rigs mark the western boundary. But let's back up. Many millions of years ago, this area was actually at the end of the continent. Those of you who live in Pullman might have had ocean views. Of course, being at the edge of a tectonic plate isn't the safest place to be. Sometimes the water level rose, which we know because there are layers of sedimentary rock deposited during the Miocene. Meanwhile, over time, strips of land collided with the ancient continent and kind of stuck to it. We call one familiar chunk that stuck the Seven Devils group. It seems to date to the Mesozoic. Another one is the Syringa group, which geologists think arrived during the Paleozoic. There were also at least 4 major lava flows. The most recent of one was the Columbia River basalt flow, the edge of which we see on that western border. It gushed out at a huge rate about 17.6 million years ago, and it kept going at that incredible rate for 1.3 million years. Then the flow began to slow down, but it took a while. It took 7 million years. I love thinking in geologic time. It gives me such a sense of perspective, you know? So our bedrock here is sort of a mishmash of ancient North American plate rocks, those smooshed on bits, sedimentary rock deposited during times when the area was underwater, and igneous rock deposited by the lava flows. And it's on top of that bedrock, of course, that we have our Loess sand dunes. Now, where did they come from? And am I saying that right? It's Loess? Loess. Loss. 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 Okay, loss. Don't confuse me. L-O-E-S-S, loss. Okay. In some places, loess is a superfine dust. Most of it's less than 60 microns, the width of half of a human hair. And the current theory of where it came from is that glaciers eroded basalt and older rocks north of us in Canada, and those glaciers then melted and dumped the water full of silt into a massive lake near what is now Missoula, Montana. At some point, an ice dam that formed part of that lake burst, and then the water flowed out and became these huge silt flats. The silt dried out, and then the wind came in, picked up the tiny particles, and deposited them to form our beloved hills. In some places, the Loess on the Palouse is more than 200 feet deep. Now, on top of this silty soil grew the Palouse prairie, which is mostly bunch grasses and different species of wildflower. How many of you have hiked to the top of Palouse Ridge? Paradise Ridge. That's what I have in my script. Especially in the spring, I love going up there. There's a remnant of relatively untouched prairie that's simply spectacular. There's so many different species of flower. Now, on the prairie, there were places where there was a little extra moisture, and there grew hawthorn thickets or groves of ponderosa pine or even Doug fir. And in the really wet spots grew the camas lilies, so thick that they looked like water, that beautiful, distinctive blue. And of course, they were also a staple in the diet of the indigenous tribes who lived in this area. One of my predecessors, the Reverend Lynn Unger, wrote this poem about the camas back when she lived here. She writes, "Consider the lilies of the field, the blue banks of camas opening into acres of sky along the road. Would the longing to lie down and be washed by that beauty abate, if you knew their usefulness? How the natives ground their bulbs for flour, how the settlers' hogs uprooted them, grunting in gleeful oblivion as the flowers fell. And you, what of your rushed and useful life? Imagine setting it all down, papers, plans, appointments, everything, leaving only a note. Gone to the fields to be lovely. Be back when I'm through with blooming." Even now, unneeded and uneaten, the camas lilies gaze out above the grass from their tender blue eyes. Even in sleep, your life will shine. Make no mistake. Of course, your work will always matter. Yet Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed like one of these. Isn't that beautiful? So animals lived here too, of course, elk and deer, very few buffalo, lots of small mammals, birds of all kinds, and under the ground are Palouse earthworms, which sometimes grew to a length of 3 feet. 3 feet, about like that. Worm. Feel like I need, are any fans of Dune out there? Yeah, maybe we need thumpers. Scientists thought for many years that these worms had gone extinct, but Biologists at the U of I found two specimens as recently as 2010, so it's possible that someday they will recover. And then, of course, there are the people who lived here. As we noted during the welcome, this place is part of the Nimipu, the Shitshumsh, and the Palouse, what they consider their traditional lands. They all moved through the area following traditional routes. They were nomadic. The first Europeans who arrived were traders, but the settlers soon followed. Wikipedia notes, since 1900, 94% of the grasslands and 97% of the wetlands in the Palouse ecoregion have been converted to crop, hay, or pasture lands. 94% of the grasslands, 97% of the wetlands. With the Europeans came the weeds, and these are weeds that, because they'd evolved in agricultural areas, were particularly suited to sink roots into soil that had been disturbed by farmers. The local native plants didn't have those same adaptations. The Palouse Prairie Foundation reports that our ecosystem, this place that's bound to our hearts, it's now considered one of the rarest ecosystems in the United States. Let that sink in for a minute. Do you remember Braiding Sweetgrass? The amazing book by Robin Wall Kimmerer that left me feeling so hopeful? She wrote both as a research biologist and an Indigenous person with deep connections to her heritage and her history, and she convinced me that the plants and animals and the land itself will teach us how to live in balance and harmony if only we will listen to them. But we have so few left here to listen to. We have to seek them out. We have to listen very, very hard. You know, if you can't get up to the top of Paradise Ridge, at least visit our little native plant garden out front. I'm sure Rod would be happy to introduce you to the plants that live there. But don't pull anything until he explains to you the difference between the natives and the invasive weeds. Rod, you want to raise your hand? That's Rod. You want to meet some plants, talk to Rod. There are a number of local organizations that are working to preserve this unique ecosystem. In addition to the Palouse Prairie Foundation, there's the Palouse Land Trust. Archie, do you still serve on their board? Yep. And the Native Plant Society, which has a plant sale every spring. We usually put it in the announcements, so keep your eyes open. You know, the young man in the reading describes European Americans as tramps. Imagine what it must have been like for the Native Americans, this hostile invasion of weird, rootless people who had this crazy idea that they had the right to own land, to extract the wealth from it, and then to sell it to developers and move on. These weird, rootless people who burned or ripped out the plants that had sustained life here for generations and planted the stuff they wanted while accidentally planting all sorts of invasive weeds. I find what rises in me is a deep need to right this terrible wrong, even though it happened long before I was born. I want to undo this shift. What happens when we wake up our feeling, our rooted sense as deep and intangible as religious faith? What happens when our connectedness to the ecological health of our land is an immediate and powerful feeling? What might happen? How might we transform when we bind this land to our hearts? You know, it's not hard to do. Nature is incredibly generous. Every time I go out to Paradise Ridge or Idler's Rest or up on Moscow Mountain, it quite simply and generously restores my soul every time. It brings me back to my best self several times a week. And it's not just me. In Japan, there's a practice called forest bathing, where folks from the city just head out into the woods. That's it. That's the extent of the practice. It's so simple, and yet researchers have documented that it lowers both stress hormones and blood pressure. This is Wendell Berry, a piece that I, for one, can't hear too often. When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought or grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. I would argue that binding this place to our hearts, sinking our roots deep, it's worth doing for the sake of the planet so that we can learn to live sustainably, learn to live more lightly. But these are scary and stressful times. So much is at stake, and we all know that it may be too late to turn things around. But coming into balance, developing a sense of place, coming home, putting down roots, binding the land to our hearts, we need to do this for ourselves. Because that part of us that binds the land to our hearts is the part of us we need in order to be whole. We need to resurrect that part of us that Western civilization and its anthropocentric worldview smothered nigh unto death. The part of us that understands that we are wild things. We are part of the ecosystem. We are not something separate and apart. I invite you then to sink your roots into this place where we live, to acknowledge that it nurtures us body and soul. I invite you to embrace our biological identity. We are just tribal omnivores, one species among many. We are not the end product of evolution. We're just one branch on a complex family tree. When we know where we are and what we are, we know better who we are and why we are and what we need to do next. So be it, and so may it be.